February 17th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, North Africa. The desert air is vibrating with the sound of artillery. Corporal Thomas Evans, an American M4 Sherman tank gunner, squints through his sight. 30 yards ahead, framed in the crosshairs, is a behemoth, a German Panzerkampfwagen 6H1, the Tiger tank. Tommy fires his 75mm armor-piercing round. The round strikes the Tiger's frontal glasses plate with a deafening metallic clang. For a brief, agonizing second, Tommy feels hope. Then the realization the round has simply disintegrated, leaving only a dark smudge. The Tiger's massive 80 gun slowly traverses toward the stationary Sherman. Tommy whispers, "Oh God, we can't even scratch it." Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. The initial Allied landings in North Africa were intended as a proving ground for American and British forces, a relatively soft entry into the European theater. Instead, they quickly became a baptism by fire, a brutal lesson in the asymmetric realities of military technology. The Allies possessed numerical superiority, but the Germans possessed a new terrifying weapon that rewrote the rules of tank warfare. The Tiger Fang. The arrival of the Tiger in late 1942 and early 1943 shattered Allied morale. It was a machine of war unlike anything the Allies had yet encountered. While Allied forces were accustomed to facing the medium Panzer I tanks, the Tiger was a revolutionary leap in both defense and offense. Its defensive capability was legendary. The Tiger I weighed nearly 56 metric tons, protected by thick vertical armor plating. The frontal glax plate was a devastating 100 millimeters thick, nearly 4 inches, and the side armor was a daunting 80 millimeters. This wasn't merely thick, it was crafted from high-quality rolled steel, providing an unprecedented level of protection. For the American and British tank crews, the experience of encountering a Tiger was often characterized by a single, agonizing sound. The metallic clang followed by the sickening thud of their own armor-piercing shells, ricocheting harmlessly off the Tiger's massive frame. Shell after shell fired from the American M4, Sherman's 75mm Uper gun, or the early British Crusaders' 2P pounder would simply shatter or bounce against the Tiger's frontal armor. It was an immediate, terrifying realization. The Tiger was, for all intents and purposes, invincible from the front. The psychological impact of the Tiger's armor was arguably as potent as its physical protection. Allied tank crews began operating under the constant, debilitating fear that they were driving into battle in vehicles that were structurally and offensively inadequate. The rule of engagement against a Tiger became a desperate tactical necessity. Never engage it from the front. They were forced to utilize the flanking maneuver, requiring 2, 3, or even 4 Shermans to distract a single Tiger, hoping one could circle around to attack the weaker, yet still formidable, side or rear armor. This was not only inefficient, but also incredibly costly in terms of lives and equipment. The Tiger's offense was equally devastating. It was armed with the fearsome ATB Team Cook 36L56 gun derived from the legendary German anti-aircraft cannon. This weapon had a higher muzzle velocity and carried a heavier shell than any Allied tank gun of the time. The 80 could reliably penetrate the frontal armor of an M4 Sherman from ranges of over 1,500 yards, 1.4 kilometers. This created an impossible equation for Allied crews. The Tiger could destroy them from ranges far exceeding the effective range of their own guns. And even when they managed to close the distance, their shells were ineffective. The Tiger was often referred to as the Schreckenspanzer, or terror tank, by the Allies. The military crisis was acute. The tank that dominated the battlefield determined the course of the war. If the Allies could not find a way to reliably penetrate the Tiger's armor, their advance, first in Italy and later in France, would be stalled indefinitely, leading to massive casualties. The disparity in anti-tank capability severely limited the effectiveness of the highly anticipated D-Day landings. The engineers and ordnance experts of the Allied nations faced an unprecedented challenge. They needed a new projectile, a breakthrough in armor-piercing technology, and they needed it fast. Standard armor-piercing AP rounds relied on sheer mass and velocity to punch a hole through steel. The Tiger's armor had exceeded the capabilities of this traditional kinetic energy principle. Simply increasing the size of the existing Allied guns was not a feasible short-term solution. It required redesigning tanks and logistical trains, a process that would take years. The answer had to come from the projectile itself, a radical redesign of the anti-tank round that could defeat the Tiger's armor without requiring an entirely new gun platform. The search for this Tiger killer began in earnest, conducted in a desperate, frantic push across Allied research facilities in the United States, Britain, and Canada. The British developed the fearsome 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a monstrous weapon that was effective but heavy and slow to deploy. However, even the 17-pounder, when firing standard armor-piercing capped APC rounds, struggled to reliably defeat the Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. The engineers realized they needed a round that could deliver a concentrated kinetic energy payload at an exponentially higher velocity. The solution was unconventional, complex, and initially viewed with extreme skepticism by the conservative Ordnance Department. It was a concept so radical, so bizarre in its appearance, compared to the familiar blunt-nosed armor-piercing rounds, that even Allied troops who saw it in testing often laughed. They were about to encounter the armor-piercing, discarding sabot APDS, a revolutionary piece of technology whose principles were first developed by the Canadians and later perfected by the British, and which would single-handedly restore the balance of power on the Western Front. The Tiger's reign of invincibility was about to meet its match, not in a bigger gun, but in a small, hyper-velocity projectile that few believed could work. The stage was set for a dramatic technological confrontation. The impenetrable wall of German steel versus the silent, weird projectile designed to vaporize it. Late 1942. Defense Research Laboratories, Ottawa, Canada. The atmosphere inside the cold utilitarian testing lab is tense, filled with a smell of burnt propellant and nervous energy. Dr. Alistair Finch, a Canadian physicist, sketches furiously on a chalkboard, illustrating a cone wrapped in a fragile casing. He taps the drawing with his chalk. The mass must be concentrated. The velocity must be hyperbolic. We cannot make the cannon bigger, so we must make the projectile smaller and faster. A British major beside him shakes his head skeptically. A dart, wrapped in tin foil. Doctor, the men will laugh this thing right off the battlefield. The crisis on the battlefield, where the American 75mm and the British 6-pounder shells were simply bouncing off the Tiger's 100mm. Frontal armor sent a clear message to Allied ordnance departments. Traditional kinetic energy rounds were obsolete. They needed a revolution, not an iteration. The traditional armor-piercing AP round worked on a straightforward principle, a heavy, blunt-nosed shell impacting the armor at high speed, using its mass and momentum to punch a hole. The Tiger's armor, however, had simply become too thick and too hard for this principle to work reliably at typical combat ranges. The only way forward was to radically increase the kinetic energy density of the projectile. This meant finding a way to deliver the same or more energy onto a much smaller point of impact, and doing so at a much higher velocity. The solution emerged not from the United States but from the combined research efforts of British and Canadian scientists. The concept was known as armor-piercing discarding sabot APDS. It was a radical, almost counterintuitive departure from established ballistics, and it looked, as the major suggested, utterly bizarre. The core genius of the APDS design lay in three revolutionary components: the subcaliber penetrator, the core. Instead of a heavy steel shell, the heart of the APDS was a small, thin, pencil-like dart made of tungsten carbide. Tungsten, a metal known for its extreme density and hardness, nearly twice as dense as steel, was the key. By using this ultra-dense, small core, the mass of the projectile was concentrated onto a tiny cross-sectional area, the sabot, the cradle. This was the weird part that Allied gunners initially mocked. To fire the small tungsten dart down a large cannon barrel like the 17-pounder, which had a 76.2 mil ball, the dart had to be encased in a lightweight, soft metal casing, the sabot, French for shoe. This sabot matched the diameter of the cannon bore, ensuring the maximum amount of propellant energy was transferred to the core. The discarding principle, the key to the high velocity, was the discarding element. The sabot, being lightweight, was designed to peel away and fall off the moment the round exited the barrel. This dramatically reduced the air resistance and drag on the small, dense tungsten core, allowing the core to fly toward the target at speeds far exceeding what a full-caliber shell could achieve. The combined effect was staggering. A standard full-caliber round from a 17-pounder might leave the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second. The APDS round, by shedding its heavy outer casing, could achieve speeds approaching 4,000 feet per second, over 120 bills. This immense velocity meant the small tungsten core carried a devastating amount of kinetic energy focused onto a pinpoint area. When it struck the Tiger's armor, instead of simply shattering, the focused energy and density of the tungsten core allowed it to penetrate the steel like a hot knife through butter. The development process, primarily led by the British and the Canadians, was fraught with challenges. The APDS was incredibly complex to manufacture, requiring precision machining of the dense tungsten cores and intricate designs for the sabot to ensure it separated cleanly and reliably. Early test rounds were erratic, often tumbling or disintegrating immediately after leaving the muzzle, earning the round the nickname the secret squirrel dart. The secrecy surrounding the project was paramount. Not only was the high-density tungsten core a strategically rare material, but the mere knowledge of the APDS's existence would have forced the Germans to radically redesign their tank armor and anti-tank doctrine. But it wasn't just the Germans who were skeptical. When the first operational APDS rounds were delivered to Allied tank units for training, the reaction was often one of derision and laughter. The rounds looked flimsy. They were small and delicate, a stark contrast to the heavy, reassuring bulk of the standard armor-piercing shells the gunners were used to handling. Experienced tank commanders often voiced their contempt, believing that this toy dart could never penetrate the massive armor of the Tiger. This skepticism was exacerbated by the logistical nightmare of integrating the APDS into the field. The new round required unique loading procedures, and its hypervelocity trajectory was subtly different from standard shells, demanding new fire tables and adjustments to range estimation. It was a new, complex tool handed to men fighting a life-and-death struggle who preferred simplicity and reliability. However, the engineers insisted Dr. Finch and his counterparts knew that physics dictated the victory. The principle of high velocity, small mass concentration, was the only viable way to defeat the Tiger's static armor defense. Their design was a response to the German technological superiority, leveraging materials, science, and ballistics where brute force had failed. The APDS was initially developed for the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, which, despite its name, was a 76. 2 Maple weapon, a weapon primarily used by the British Army and fitted onto tanks like the Sherman Firefly and the Achilles tank destroyer. This was the only gun platform rugged and powerful enough to launch the APDS core at its required high velocity. The stage was now set for the first true field test. The APDS rounds were quietly designated as special ammunition and distributed only to select units equipped with the 17-pounder. The German gunners, confident in their tanks' invincibility, continued to laugh at the sight of the Allied tanks they could dispatch from a safe distance. They were unaware that a small secret team of Canadian and British scientists had just handed the Allied tank crews the one thing they desperately needed: the power to fight back, face to face, against the Tiger. The weird round was about to stop the laughter for good. Late July 1944, Normandy, France, near the town of K. Sergeant Major Arthur M. Macmillan, commander of a Sherman Firefly, a standard Sherman fitted with the monstrous 17-pounder gun, stares through his binoculars. Across the field, 2 Tiger I tanks are systematically destroying a column of British infantry. Mac's gunner, Private David O'Connell, is nervous. He's loaded the new strange APDS round, the one they call the Tin Dart. Mac takes a deep breath. David, forget the weight, forget the laughter. You know the drill. Center mass. Fire when ready. The 17-pounder roars. But the sound is different, sharper, higher pitched, followed by a fleeting metallic whisper as the sabot falls away. The summer of 1944 was the proving ground for the armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS. Following the D-Day landings, Allied forces were locked in a grinding, brutal battle across the hedge and fields of Normandy. The German defense was ferocious, anchored by the presence of the Tiger, the One, and its successor, the heavier Tiger II, King Tiger. The threat remained the same. Allied tanks, primarily the M4 Sherman, were still fatally outmatched in terms of armor protection and main gun power. The British military, having committed fully to the APDS technology, was the first to deploy it operationally and in significant numbers. The chosen delivery platform was the Sherman Firefly, an ingenious, if awkward, modification that swapped the Sherman's original 75mm gun for the massive, high-velocity 17-pounder anti-tank cannon. This combination of the reliable Sherman chassis with the powerful 17-pounder was the only way the Allies could initially match the Tiger's firepower. But even the 17-pounder, when firing standard armor-piercing capped APC rounds, could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger Wine at distances over 1,000 yards. They needed the secret weapon, the APDS. The APDS rounds were strictly controlled, issued only to Firefly crews, who were often skeptical. They had been trained for years on the doctrine of mass and impact. Handling the light, delicatelle-looking APDS was counterintuitive, and its performance was shrouded in mystery. They were told it was their only chance against the Tiger, but they had to see it to believe it. The first major engagements featuring the APDS rounds were moments of battlefield shock, both for the Allies and more profoundly for the Germans. Consider the experience of a German Tiger gunner. Confident in his position, he has already dispatched multiple Allied tanks, their shells simply deflecting or fragmenting against his 100mm armor. The process is predictable. He absorbs the incoming fire, precisely targets the smaller Allied tank, and fires his 80 bimeters, resulting in a catastrophic fiery explosion. The Tiger is an observation platform of invincibility. Then, the APDS round strikes. Unlike the blunt, loud impact of a standard shell, the APDS hit with a terrifying high-pitched crack, followed almost immediately by a catastrophic internal explosion. The small hypervelocity tungsten core didn't merely penetrate the armor. Its concentrated energy density caused the core and the resulting fragments of armor plate to spray through the tank's fighting compartment at immense speed. A phenomenon known as spowing. The kinetic energy was so extreme that it could often cause the internal air to briefly compress and ignite, essentially vaporizing the crew and internal systems instantly. The reaction of the German tank crews was one of sudden, utter terror and confusion. When Allied tanks were disabled, they usually suffered recognizable damage: a burnt-out shell, a damaged track, or a clear impact crater where the shell failed to penetrate. But tanks hit by APDS often showed only a deceptively small entry hole on the frontal armor, yet were instantly and violently killed. German ordnance reports began to filter back to command, describing bizarre and inexplicable kills. They reported Tiger tanks, supposedly invincible from the front, being knocked out by single shots at ranges where Allied guns should have been useless. The German gunners who had laughed at the sight of the Allied tanks they easily dominated were suddenly confronted by a silent killer. They initially theorized that the Allies must be using some form of new, high-powered chemical round or a previously unseen anti-tank rocket, because the physics of traditional kinetic energy penetration could not explain the damage. They couldn't conceive that the small foreign object that had killed their tank was nothing more than a simple hypervelocity metal dart. For the Allied crews, the APDS round was a massive morale booster. For the first time, they felt they had a weapon that could truly neutralize the Tiger's power. Macmillan's Firefly crews, initially skeptical, became fervent believers. They learned to rely on the tin dart, reserving their precious APDS rounds for the moment a Tiger appeared on the horizon. The tactical necessity of flanking was still important. But now a direct frontal engagement was no longer a guaranteed death sentence. A highly trained gunner could take the shot and win. One of the most famous, albeit likely embellished, accounts involves the use of APDS by the legendary British tank Sergeant Sidney Radley Walters of the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment. His unit's Fireflies engaged a column of Tigers and successfully neutralized them in a quick succession of frontal shots, leaving the German commanders reeling. These battlefield successes, replicated across Normandy, began to sow seeds of doubt in the German armored corps. The deployment of APDS had a profound cascading effect on the battle, reduced psychological superiority. The German psychological advantage built on the Tiger's invincibility was instantly broken. German tank commanders could no longer simply sit and absorb damage, forcing them to adopt more cautious and defensive maneuvers. Increased engagement range. Allied tanks could now engage the Tiger at ranges approaching or even exceeding the distance the Tiger could detect, and accurately fire back. Although the Admitimus still maintained a range advantage, the gap in effective combat range was drastically reduced. Changed tank deployment. The existence of APDS meant the Allies could more confidently deploy their Firefly and Achilles tank destroyers in forward positions, challenging the German heavy armor head-on instead of relying purely on ambushes. The APDS round developed in secret Canadian and British laboratories had successfully reversed the technological superiority held by the Tiger Eye. It was a victory achieved not by building a bigger gun, but by rethinking the very concept of a projectile, a small, scorned dart that delivered a silent, terrifying message to the German gunners. Your wall is no longer strong enough. The groundwork was laid for the final phase of the tank war, one where raw armor thickness alone would no longer guarantee victory. September 1944, a German Army High Command briefing room, Eastern France, General Staff officers, their faces grim, look at a diagram of a destroyed Tiger tank. The image shows a small, clean entry hole on the frontal armor, followed by catastrophic internal damage. Colonel Reinhardt, a veteran tank commander, slams his fist on the table. This is not the work of standard Allied ordnance. Our Tigers are supposed to stop the 17-pounder, but this is a needle, a high-velocity dart. They are not fighting fair. The air is heavy with the dawning, terrifying realization that their technological superiority is over. The battles of 1944 across Normandy and the subsequent push into France marked the decisive end of the Tiger tank's undisputed reign. It was a victory won not by building a bigger tank, but by deploying a smaller, smarter projectile, the armor-piercing discarding Sabot, APDS. This weird Canadian and British round was the technological equalizer, a silent hypervelocity answer to the German doctrine of impenetrable armor. The deployment of APDS had a profound cascading effect that went beyond the destruction of individual tanks. It fundamentally altered the psychological and tactical landscape of tank warfare. The most significant impact of the APDS was psychological for years. The core strength of German heavy armor, the Tiger of Wine, and the later King Tiger, was the absolute confidence of their crews in their frontal armor. This confidence allowed them to dictate engagements. They could stop, absorb fire, and then leisurely choose their targets. The APDS round destroyed this tactical certainty. German ordnance inspectors, initially mystified by the clean, small entry wounds on the disabled Tigers, quickly determined that a new high-velocity projectile was at fault. The discovery spread quickly among the German armored units. The laughter and scorn that German gunners once held for the Allied shells vanished, replaced by a deep-seated fear. Commanders could no longer rely on their armor to save them. They were forced to adopt defensive, cautious tactics, constantly maneuvering and relying on camouflage, a stark contrast to their previous aggressive dominance. This fear led to a critical change in German doctrine. Tanks had to be used less aggressively and often deployed in static ambush positions, relying on the element of surprise rather than relying on their armor's resistance. This reduced mobility directly hampered the German ability to mount effective counterattacks against the advancing Allied forces. The APDS round in effect slowed the German war machine down. The success of the APDS was a pure victory for material science and ballistics. It proved that velocity and density could defeat mass and thickness. The tungsten carbide core, despite its small size, transferred all its energy into a minuscule area, creating a highly localized stress that the steel armor could not withstand. The subsequent German attempts to counter this round were slow and often ineffective. They could not simply make the armor thicker without rendering the tank immobile. The only reliable defense against the APDS was angled armor, sloping the armor plates to increase the effective thickness and induce ricochet, a principle the Soviets had already implemented with the T-34 and which the Germans later adopted with the Panther and King Tiger. However, even the King Tiger's thick, sloped frontal armor remained vulnerable to APDS fire at shorter ranges, particularly from the powerful upgraded versions of the 17-pounder. The APDS was the unsung hero that allowed the 17-pounder gun, already a formidable weapon, to remain relevant and deadly throughout the entire war, preventing the Allies from having to immediately halt production and redesign their entire medium tank fleet. It was the crucial bridge technology that kept Allied tanks in the fight until the American 76 MiG and the British 20-pounder guns could be deployed. The story of the APDS is a profound example of how a small, weird technological breakthrough, developed by scientists in labs far from the battlefield, can unilaterally shift the balance of military power. It proved that innovation, not just sheer industrial muscle, determines who wins. If you find these untold stories of technical genius and battlefield strategy fascinating, and you want to ensure you catch our next deep dive into the weapons that defined World War II, including the other major breakthroughs in armor and aviation, we urge you to subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments. What other underdog military technology do you think deserves its moment in the spotlight? The APDS was more than just a wartime innovation. It was the foundational ancestor of every modern kinetic energy anti-tank round used today. After the war, the APDS concept was continually refined. The original APDS suffered from poor accuracy over long distances because the separation of the sabot was often inconsistent. Engineers solved this problem by developing the armor-piercing fins stabilized discarding sabot AP of his desk. This round is essentially the same high-velocity dart, but it is fitted with stabilizing fins, like a massive arrow, to ensure perfect aerodynamic stability after the sabot is discarded. The APFSDS is the standard main gun ammunition for almost every tank in the world today, including the American M1 Abrams, the British Challenger, and the German Leopard. The principle remains identical to the weird Canadian round, first developed in 1943. A hypervelocity, high-density core, now often depleted uranium instead of tungsten, that defeats armor by kinetic energy density rather than mass. The German gunners who laughed at the small, unconventional projectile in 1943 were laughing at the future of anti-tank warfare. That initial weird design was the death nail for static thick armor. It forced tank design to prioritize sloped protection, lighter materials, and active defenses over sheer bulk. The APDS didn't win the war single-handedly, but it won the tank war. It restored the confidence of Allied crews, neutralized the terrifying dominance of the Tiger, and ensured that the rapid Allied advance through Europe could continue without being fatally stalled by the German heavy armor divisions. It is a quiet, powerful testament to the decisive impact of applied science and the genius of the engineers who fought the war not with a rifle, but with a simple yet revolutionary dart.